Before we begin this journey, it's worth noting that all imagery presented here is metaphorical in nature, artistic representations designed to explore ideas. The content is intended for reflection and intellectual exploration, not as a substitute for professional psychological advice or any form of therapy. Decoding the psychology of the lazy yet ambitious. There exists a type of individual who lives in a constant state of inner contradiction. Within them are grand visions of the future, clear images of who they could become. Yet their external reality remains stagnant, inert, even decaying. They are not lacking in ambition, but they find themselves unable to act. And over time, what lingers is a quiet accumulation of shame and self-reproach. I once believed this was simply laziness, but the deeper I looked, the more it became clear that this is a complex psychological structure, one long recognized within depth psychology. In this piece, I will outline 3 fundamental psychological patterns that shape the lazy yet ambitious individual, and why most productivity advice fails if this structure is not understood. If you find that this perspective offers you a new way of seeing yourself, or even just a fleeting moment of contact with something more authentic within, you can support this exploration of the psychological shadow by liking and subscribing. Your support not only sustains the channel, but helps bring thoughtful, in-depth content to a wider audience. Each like, each subscription may seem small, but it allows these ideas to continue expanding in ways greater than you might imagine. Now, the first psychological pattern is perhaps the most recognizable. You possess expansive visions of the future, clear images of who you will become and what you will achieve. Yet, you are unable to sustain consistent effort beyond a few weeks. The initial surge of energy is powerful, but it fades quickly, leaving behind fragmentation and incompletion. You have big dreams. You can vividly imagine your own success, to the point where it feels almost real. But when it comes time to actually begin, you hesitate. You wait. You tell yourself that tomorrow will be different. And when tomorrow arrives, it unfolds exactly the same. You are not alone in this. There is an entire group of individuals just like you, ambitious, imaginative, yet immobilized. And perhaps the most painful part is this. You know you are capable of more, yet you cannot seem to bring yourself to act. The second pattern is a persistent obsession with finding the perfect system, the ideal productivity method, the optimal strategy, the correct framework. You believe that once the right formula is discovered, everything will fall into place, and success will follow automatically. You hold such a precise image of success that anything less feels like failure. And so, you wait. You wait for the perfect plan. You wait until you feel ready. But perfection never arrives. Readiness never comes. And while you wait, life continues to move forward without you. Perfectionism is not about having high standards. It is fear disguised as the pursuit of excellence. The third pattern reveals itself in recurring cycles of intense self-doubt and inadequacy. You oscillate between 2 extremes. On one side, seductive fantasies of future success. On the other, deep self-contempt for your present inertia. You may think you lack discipline. You may believe that successful people possess some inherent quality that you do not. You may even assume that with just a bit more motivation, everything would change. But this is not the case. Motivation is an emotion, and emotions come and go. A life cannot be built upon something so unstable. You become either the hero of your imagined future or someone entirely worthless in the present. There is no middle ground, no gray area. What's crucial to understand is that this pattern is not merely a bad habit. It is a recognized psychological configuration deeply tied to existential anxieties of the self. And once you truly grasp its nature, the way you see yourself may shift entirely. You will begin to see that this is not a problem of willpower or discipline. And when you understand the structure beneath it, you gain the possibility of finding real solutions, rather than endlessly repeating productivity techniques designed for an entirely different psychological makeup. In fact, much of modern productivity advice becomes irrelevant once you realize that it assumes a psychological structure you may not possess. Take, for instance, the common advice to set clear goals and visualize success daily. This works for individuals with a relatively stable sense of self, those capable of sustained effort without relying on compensatory fantasies. But for someone with a more fragile or narcissistically structured psyche, visualization does not trigger action. Instead, it feeds grandiose fantasies, making the imagined world more satisfying than reality, and in doing so, diminishes the drive to act. Or consider the advice to find your inner motivation and act only when inspired. This assumes that inspiration is a reliable signal for action. But for this psychological type, emotion itself becomes paralyzing. Without inspiration, they cannot act. With inspiration, they consume it in fantasy rather than translate it into real work. The result is a self-reinforcing loop of dreaming and delay. Then there are systems waking up earlier, building the perfect morning routine, optimizing every hour. These systems are designed for individuals who can tolerate imperfection without collapsing in self-worth. But for someone with a fragile internal structure, each failure to maintain the ideal routine becomes evidence of personal inadequacy, triggering shame, self-loathing, and eventual withdrawal. Even seemingly rational strategies breaking goals into smaller steps, tracking progress, measuring performance, often fail. Not because they are flawed, but because they assume that failure is neutral data. In this psychological structure, however, every unmet metric is unconsciously interpreted as a personal invalidation, a collapse of the grandiose self-image. As a result, people avoid these systems, not out of laziness, but as a way of protecting a vulnerable sense of self. And then there is the most common advice of all. Just be more disciplined. This may be the clearest example of a categorical error. Discipline, in psychological terms, cannot exist without a sufficiently stable sense of self, one that can endure discomfort without collapsing in value. When you demand discipline from a structure that has not yet been integrated, you are not fostering growth. You are activating defense mechanisms that lead to paralysis, procrastination, and self-punishment. So the issue is not that these forms of advice are wrong. The issue is that they are designed for a different kind of mind, for individuals who do not rely on fantasy to maintain their sense of worth. When applied to the lazy yet ambitious, they do not lead to improvement, but to repeated failure and deepening shame. What is truly happening within this pattern is a form of psychological splitting. At its core lies a defense mechanism against a deep fear of inadequacy. You long for greatness, yet you resist confronting the real risks that come with genuine effort. You want the identity of an ambitious person without accepting the possibility of failure that action inevitably brings. Psychology has recognized this pattern for decades. Today, it appears in millions of people because it is a predictable response to certain disruptions in psychological development. One of the greatest challenges early psychoanalysts faced was understanding patients who genuinely desired success, yet were unable to sustain effort. Initially, such individuals were seen as lacking discipline or moral character, but over time, a pattern emerged. Many of these patients were intelligent, thoughtful, and clearly ambitious, yet entirely unable to maintain consistent performance. It became evident that this was not a character flaw, but a psychological structure. And to understand it, one had to trace its origins. This is where depth psychology begins to illuminate the issue. Conscious desire is never strong enough to overcome unconscious resistance. So what, ultimately, is happening beneath the surface? Analysts have identified several key mechanisms at play. As we continue, you may begin to recognize patterns such as narcissistic defense structures, perfectionism as self-protection, and the split between shame and grandiosity. To truly understand why so many intelligent, capable, and ambitious individuals struggle to act, we must look at early findings in depth psychology. When clinicians observed patients consistently avoiding genuine effort, they did not dismiss it as simple laziness. Instead, they asked, what psychological function does this avoidance serve? What they discovered was this. These individuals were unconsciously protecting a grand self-image by avoiding real-world challenges. They maintained the illusion of future greatness by refusing to act in the present. In this context, laziness is not a lack of motivation. It is a defense mechanism, shielding them from the possibility of confronting an uncomfortable truth, that they may be ordinary. Ambition, therefore, is preserved within imagination, where it can never be tested and thus never disproven. A second mechanism appears in the form of what many mistake for perfectionism. Patients often claim they simply need the right conditions before they begin. But deeper analysis reveals that this is not preference. It is defense. Its function is to protect the self from narcissistic injury by only allowing the possibility of producing something flawless. For an idealized self-image, creating something mediocre is psychologically intolerable. The logic is closed and self-sustaining. If conditions are not perfect, you never begin. And if you never begin, you can never be criticized. In this way, perfection remains intact within imagination, while reality is avoided. It is through mechanisms like these that the lazy yet ambitious have become increasingly common, especially in modern society. They live in prolonged frustration, trapped in inner paralysis. And once we understand this structure, it becomes clear that traditional cultural narratives fail to grasp its depth. Older views rely on moral judgment, labeling such individuals as lazy or lacking character. Meanwhile, modern productivity culture must sell solutions, so it simplifies the problem into something easily fixable. As a result, it produces shallow narratives, packaged as habit systems and motivational frameworks. But the truth is this. Millions are caught within this psychological structure, and surface-level solutions cannot reach its root. Some estimates even suggest that between 15 and 20% of intelligent, educated individuals carry this lazy yet ambitious pattern within them. This condition creates a profound level of psychological suffering. Because when you find yourself trapped in this cycle, having tried every method yet still failing, you can no longer understand why you keep arriving at the same unsatisfying outcome. So how can this be explained? It is precisely from this impasse that psychology was compelled to move beyond surface behavior and into the realm of deeper structures. From the mid-20th century onwards, psychologists such as Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg began to systematically study narcissistic personality, not as a flaw, but as a self-structure formed during early development. Their central question was not why people are lazy, but why certain intelligent, ambitious individuals are unable to sustain effort despite a genuine desire for achievement. What emerged consistently across their work was this: the structure has very specific origins in childhood, rooted in subtle distortions during the formation of the self. And this is the critical point. Certain developmental failures prevent the emerging ego from forming a stable sense of self-worth, forcing it instead to rely on inflated self-images. Carl Jung proposed that when the self, the totality of one's psychological life, is not properly reflected by the developmental environment, the ego is compelled to construct a substitute image in order to anchor itself and survive. The inevitable consequence is an avoidance of real-world testing, because reality always carries the risk of shattering that idealized image. What many fail to recognize is that children who experience specific deficits in upbringing often develop narcissistic structures as a form of developmental trauma. In some cases, parents excessively idealize the child, constantly reflecting back an image of exceptionalism, yet fail to support the development of corresponding real-world competence. In other cases, parents fail to meet fundamental emotional needs. They do not attune, do not recognize, do not truly see the child's inner world. As a result, the child is never affirmed in their authentic self and is forced to retreat into imagination as a form of psychological refuge. The deepest consequence of both pathways is the same. The child never develops a cohesive and reality-aligned sense of self. Instead, a split structure emerges: an idealized self living in fantasy, and a weak, shame-laden self pushed into the shadows. From a Jungian perspective, this rejected part does not disappear. It becomes the shadow, carrying feelings of inadequacy, helplessness, and shame. Another common developmental pattern occurs when a child experiences emotional neglect. In response, they construct increasingly elaborate compensatory fantasies. Within these imagined worlds, they are special, important, valuable, because only there can the self escape the pain of not being recognized in reality. Over time, the child learns that the external world offers no validation, and when imagination becomes the sole means of maintaining self-worth, the internal fantasy world inevitably becomes far more appealing than external reality. When the entire psychological structure organizes itself around this illusion, a very distinct pattern emerges. Some individuals can spend hours, even days, lost in fantasies of success, recognition, and future status. As a person begins to live primarily within imagination, real-world effort starts to feel empty and meaningless by comparison. The result is a deep internal split, a sense of greatness in fantasy paired with an experience of helplessness in reality. And it is precisely this split that forms the near-perfect blueprint for the lazy yet ambitious psyche. It is important to understand that immersion in fantasy is not inherently pathological. On the contrary, it often helps the child survive unbearable psychological pain. When a child grows up in neglect or emotional deprivation, imagination provides the necessary compensation for continued existence. The problem arises when this imagined world ceases to be a temporary refuge and instead becomes the central structure of the self. At that point, the individual can no longer function in reality as a fully integrated adult. In more severe cases, they may remain permanently trapped within their own illusions. You may be someone with ambition, but trapped within a psychological pattern formed decades ago. And it is precisely this developmental stagnation that produces clear dysfunction in adulthood. The third mechanism within this structure, and perhaps the most recognizable, is the cycle of grandiosity and shame. Individuals with this pattern are often acutely aware that they oscillate between two extremes: a sense of being destined for greatness and a feeling of complete worthlessness. There is no middle ground, no stable or realistic self-assessment. When the grand illusion can no longer be sustained, they collapse into profound shame and self-hatred. This is the moment when the defensive structure temporarily fails and reality begins to break through. Within this kind of narcissistic self-structure, nothing is truly stable. As you can see, these three mechanisms do not operate in isolation. They are interconnected, forming an integrated defensive system. And this is precisely why conventional productivity advice consistently fails for this group. Even if, on the surface, it appears they simply need more discipline or better habits, the deeper truth is this: they carry a psychological structure that makes sustained effort nearly impossible. To illustrate this, consider a classic case documented in psychoanalytic literature. The patient displayed all three mechanisms: grandiose fantasies, paralysis driven by perfectionism, and cycles of oscillation between superiority and shame. This was an intelligent individual, trapped in this loop for decades. Through long-term psychotherapy, early developmental failures were gradually uncovered, and only through years of analytic work could the split aspects of the self begin, slowly, to reintegrate. Clinical literature has documented specific therapeutic approaches for this structure. What you must understand is that these issues cannot be resolved through willpower alone, nor through productivity systems. So why do individuals caught in this pattern continue to return to the same behavioral solutions, even when they have never truly worked? The answer is simple. They do not realize that this is a psychological structure. Modern culture encourages people to view this as a behavioral issue rather than a psychological one. This perspective is necessary to sustain the productivity and self-help industry. However, this pattern exists across all cultures and societies, often rooted in similar developmental conditions. So the real question is not whether you have enough discipline. The question is this: will you continue to approach this as a behavior problem, or will you begin to address it as a psychological one? The choice is yours. It is a decision about what level of intervention truly matches the nature of the problem. You may continue experimenting with productivity systems and habit-building techniques, but that path often leads only to repeated failure and an ever-deepening sense of shame. Behavioral interventions cannot resolve underlying psychological structures. They completely bypass the unconscious. They serve the self-help industry, but they do not serve those with narcissistic personality structures. The alternative path is to seek in-depth psychotherapy, to work with clinicians who are properly trained in narcissistic structures, and to begin a long-term process of integrating the fragmented parts of the self. Only then can this pattern truly be addressed. In that sense, a purely behavioral approach is a categorical error. It applies the wrong kind of solution to the nature of the problem. What is striking is that modern culture, in many ways, benefits from people not recognizing this as a psychological issue. The productivity industry profits from repeated cycles of failed effort, while deep therapeutic work remains niche, costly, and difficult to access. As a result, this understanding is often obscured from the majority. So we find ourselves at a moment of awareness, a turning point where a choice must be made. You can continue blaming yourself for a lack of discipline, believing the problem lies in personal willpower. Or you can begin to understand that you are dealing with a psychological structure that requires depth-oriented intervention, and that continuing to rely on behavioral methods will only lead to repeated failure. Look at any case where this pattern has genuinely been resolved, any real success story from long-term psychotherapy. What do they all share? Not more sophisticated habit systems, but deep psychological work that directly addresses unconscious mechanisms. And that work requires years of commitment. It involves confronting painful childhood experiences and gradually integrating parts of the self that were split off early in development. To date, this remains one of the most effective approaches for this specific personality structure. Which naturally raises a question. If this pattern originates in childhood, can it truly be resolved? The answer is yes. But not through self-help or sheer effort alone. It requires appropriate, depth-oriented therapeutic intervention. Why then can those who are lazy yet ambitious not simply improve through willpower or better systems? Because you cannot consciously override unconscious defense structures. From a psychological standpoint, you are dealing with mechanisms formed in early life, operating outside awareness, designed to protect the psyche even when they cause suffering. And that suffering becomes embedded within the very structure of your personality. This is not a matter of weakness or a lack of discipline, and when a fundamentally psychological problem is treated as a behavioral one, the result is inevitable: repeated failure accompanied by intensifying shame. In reality, many individuals cycle through one productivity system after another, investing genuine effort each time, only to fail and eventually conclude that something is inherently wrong with them, that they are somehow defective. But what is actually happening is far simpler. They are using behavioral tools to solve a structural psychological issue. This is not to say that everyone who is lazy yet ambitious requires therapy. But for those who truly carry a narcissistic structure, this pattern will not resolve unless the psychological dimension is addressed. If you continue applying behavioral solutions to structural psychological problems, the outcome is predictable. You will remain trapped in the same loop, with an ever-deepening sense of shame. In many ways, this is where expert knowledge and popular culture diverge. This pattern has been studied in psychology for over a century, yet mainstream culture rarely engages with its depth. What remains is a gap between depth psychology and the surface-level advice of self-help culture. And unfortunately, that is the reality we live in. So despite the advances in psychology, despite the existence of nuanced understanding and effective treatments, most people caught in this pattern will never encounter this knowledge. And what happens when someone finally discovers a psychological explanation for their struggle? Often it brings a profound sense of relief, mixed with grief. Relief because there is finally an explanation. Grief because of the years lost in misunderstanding. If people understood that this is a psychological structure, not a moral or personal failing, millions might seek the help that truly matches their needs. So what should someone do if they recognize this lazy yet ambitious pattern within themselves? particularly in its narcissistic form? The honest answer begins with a simple but crucial step: accepting that this is a psychological structure, not a behavioral flaw. Understanding the true nature of the problem is what allows for the right kind of intervention. Those who genuinely resolve this pattern are often the ones who accept the need for psychological support. Clinically, the core of this process lies in integrating the split between the grandiose self and the diminished, shame-based self. Over time, this allows individuals to develop, but in the short term, they must accept that they are dealing with a psychological structure that requires deep-level adjustment. This means committing to appropriate long-term therapy, tolerating the discomfort of confronting painful memories, and letting go of the hope for quick behavioral fixes. This is the realistic path, because structural psychological problems cannot be resolved through willpower alone. If you continue searching for quick fixes at the behavioral level, you may remain stuck for decades, investing time and energy into solutions that were never designed for your kind of problem. There are also approaches inspired by thinkers like Carl Jung that involve working with the unconscious independently. However, it must be said clearly, this is not a path of rapid transformation, nor one of easy or comforting healing as it is often portrayed. As Carl Jung once said, there is no awakening without a price, and that price is often pain. If you carry the lazy yet ambitious structure, that price may be the willingness to let go of the illusion that you can change without confronting what hurts most. Your problem does not lie in willpower. Jung described this as an imbalance between the conscious ego and the self. When the ego becomes inflated through ambition and imagination, while the self is not grounded in lived experience, the psyche begins to generate unconscious mechanisms that prevent action. Not because you are lazy, but because the unconscious recognizes that real action could shatter the identity you have relied on to survive. Without therapy, the only way to approach this layer is to create conditions in which the unconscious can reveal itself. Jung referred to this as allowing the unconscious to speak, rather than constantly imposing discipline or moral judgment upon it. The first step is learning to observe yourself without immediately intervening. Each time you are about to do something important, but fall into procrastination, fatigue, paralysis, or inexplicable resistance, pause and face that moment directly. Do not try to fix it. Do not force yourself into structure. Do not criticize. Jung emphasized that what you resist persists. What you face begins to transform. Simply being seen begins to weaken the defense. The second task is to work seriously with your inner world of imagination. For this psychological structure, imagination is not a flaw. It is a survival strategy formed in childhood. Jung described it as a compensatory function of the psyche. When reality fails to reflect your value, the unconscious creates grand images to preserve self-worth. The problem is not that you imagine, but that you identify entirely with those images. So instead of trying to suppress imagination, begin to engage with it. When you find yourself fantasizing about success, power, or recognition, ask sincerely, what fear is this image protecting me from? If you continue asking this question, it will eventually lead you back to early memories, where your younger self learned that only by becoming exceptional could you be worthy of love. The third task is to face the shadow, not through thought, but through lived experience. Jung defined the shadow as everything the ego rejects because it does not fit the ideal image. For you, the shadow often takes the form of ordinariness, failure, limitation, and the feeling of being no one. The only way to integrate the shadow is through unglamorous reality. Consistent effort, humble work, responsibilities that bring no recognition, not as punishment, but as a way for your nervous system to learn that you still exist, still have value, even when you are not exceptional. As Jung made clear, no one becomes enlightened by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. The fourth task, and perhaps the most painful, is learning to remain with shame without escaping it. In narcissistic structures, shame marks the collapse of the ego. You either rise into grandiosity or fall into self-contempt. But the self exists in neither extreme. It emerges in the space between, where you no longer need to be extraordinary, but also no longer condemn yourself as worthless. Jung called this the process of individuation, learning to accept the truth of who you are without relying on defensive illusions. If you walk a spiritual path, this becomes even more delicate. Jung warned sharply against using spirituality to bypass psychological work, what is now often called spiritual bypassing. Practices like mindfulness or ego dissolution only have value if they expose defense mechanisms, not conceal them behind comforting ideas. Spirituality that does not integrate the shadow refines the ego. It does not make a person whole. And here is a difficult truth. All of these paths are slow, demanding, and more uncertain than therapy. Because you are entering the unconscious without the containment of a trained guide. Jung himself acknowledged the need for deep relational reflection to avoid being overwhelmed in the process. But if therapy is not accessible, the minimum you can do is stop harming yourself with superficial behavioral fixes. You do not need to become exceptional. You do not need to fix yourself quickly. What you need is to understand that your stagnation was once an adaptation, a way your psyche learned to survive. When you begin to see it this way, the unconscious becomes less resistant. And when it no longer needs to protect you through paralysis, genuine transformation can begin. As Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." So, how do you know if you are truly touching the unconscious rather than simply convincing yourself? The first sign is not relief, but a subtle discomfort. As you approach the unconscious, you do not feel stronger or more positive. Instead, you feel less certain about the narratives that once defined you. Explanations like, "I just need more discipline," or "I lack motivation," begin to lose their grip. Jung noted that when the unconscious begins to surface, the ego experiences it as disorientation. You no longer feel certain of who you are. And that ambiguity signals that an old structure is beginning to crack. The second sign is the weakening of grand fantasies. Without the accompanying pleasure of self-criticism, you may notice that you no longer indulge in intense visions of an extraordinary future. Not out of disappointment, but because those fantasies begin to feel empty. Jung described this as the moment when the idealized self-image loses its psychic energy. You no longer need imagined success to endure the present. Though this may initially create a sense of emptiness, it also signals that the shadow is being integrated. The third sign is your growing ability to remain with shame instead of escaping it. Previously, failure or procrastination would trigger either grandiose fantasies or harsh self-rejection. As you touch the unconscious, this cycle begins to slow. You still feel shame, but it no longer consumes you entirely. You can feel it in your body, in your chest, your stomach, without needing to explain it away or flee from it. Jung considered the capacity to hold conflicting emotions a key marker of individuation. The fourth sign is a shift in the quality of your motivation. You no longer act out of fear of being worthless, nor from the need to prove your greatness. Some days, you may do very little, but that no longer leads to self-hatred. Jung described this as a transition from ego-driven motivation to self-driven action. Behavior becomes less about protecting an image and more about aligning, however faintly, with an inner sense of rightness. The fifth sign appears in your dreams. For many, this is the clearest indicator. Dreams become more vivid, more unusual, sometimes unsettling. You may dream of failure, exposure, rejection, or images that are no longer heroic. Jung saw dreams as the direct language of the unconscious. When the unconscious is being heard, it begins to speak more, and not always in comforting ways. The sixth sign is a diminishing obsession with progress. When you are caught in self-improvement loops, you constantly measure yourself. Am I better than yesterday? More disciplined this week? As you enter deeper psychological work, that concern fades. Not because you have given up, but because you begin to sense that transformation is not linear. Jung described individuation as a spiral movement, where you revisit the same points with greater awareness each time. The seventh sign is the emergence of genuine self-compassion. Not superficial reassurance, not forced positivity, but a clear, grounded recognition: this is how I had to be in order to survive. At that point, you no longer need to hate your stagnation, nor glorify it. You begin to see it as part of your psychological history, not a final verdict on who you are. Jung wrote that the true sign of transformation is not happiness, but an expansion of consciousness. You see more, you can endure more, and you no longer feel the same urgency to escape yourself. If you are experiencing even fragments of this, however faint or slow, it may mean that you are no longer merely convincing yourself. You are beginning to enter a space where the unconscious is participating in your conscious life. Thank you for staying until the end, and for walking alongside this exploration of the psychological shadow into the deeper layers of the human inner world. Not everyone has the patience to listen this far. Not everyone is willing to face themselves. The fact that you are here, still listening, suggests a certain seriousness toward your inner life. Perhaps what you've heard will not remain as mere understanding, but will continue to work quietly within you, in its own time, in its own way. And if one day you feel the need to return, this space will still be here, without judgment, without pressure, simply accompanying you in silence.